In the previous lesson, we mentioned briefly at the end that I was going to spend some time talking about this policy of concentration. Um, Again, a policy that examines the nature and the relationship between the native populations and the settlers in America. Now, the policy of concentration was intended to manage the growing tensions that were inevitably forming between Native Americans and the settlers. The ultimate problem, though, and the ultimate conclusion of the policy of concentration was that it escalated into conflict, to dislocation of native peoples, and to just broader violent confrontations. So, we're going to first think about what the policy of concentration was, and then we're going to explain why the policy of concentration failed. And then we will start talking about more conflicts in future lessons. So, it emerges in the 19th century, mid-19th century, as part of the US response, the US government's response to an increase in settler colonial violence and to the increasing expansion of settlers in the West. Specifically, settlers in the West settling in Native American territories. Ultimately, as the US policy begins to shift towards this idea of West Manifest Destiny, the policy aims to relocate Native American tribes to designated areas that would prevent further conflict between the settlers and the indigenous groups. In 1851, as we already know, we see the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was signed between various different tribes and the US government, which was the sort of precursor to concentration, and was an agreement that essentially delimited the number of, or at least delimited the borders in which Native Americans would be their land. It offered to protect settlers. It also offered to give settlers a lot of compensation in the form of annuities. But of course, none of these things really came to fruition, and the Treaty of Fort Laramie would ultimately fail. Now, under the system that was the policy of concentration, native tribes were assigned specific reservations, and this was to limit their movement and to also limit their interaction with other settlers. Now, theoretically, this had the result of preserving both native lands and also preserving the safety of settlers. However, as you can probably imagine, given the fact that we don't need to be that charitable towards the US government at this point, the policy was fundamentally flawed from the start due to a number of factors. And we will explain why those factors are next here. So, ultimately, there are multiple reasons why the policy of concentration fails. The first is the fact that Native Americans were dependent on vast territories. They were nomadic tribes. And so, ultimately, tribes such as the Lakota, such as the Shawnee tribes, were deeply connected to their territory. And so, often following patterns of migration for buffalo herds and hunting for sustenance, for example. And so the result is that if you limit their movement, then this is just going to fundamentally limit their way of life, and they're less likely to adhere to this principle. The Lakota tribe, for example, were particularly reliant on bison for food and for clothing and for tools. Their way of life was intrinsically tied to the freedom of movement that existed across the plains. The Shawnee tribe also relied on large swaths of land to hunt and to sustain their populations. Another reason why the failure of concentration took place was because the basic formulation of the Laramie Treaty, which sort of formalized concentration, the policy of concentration, was ambiguously worded and was not understood by the US government and by native tribes. The treaty defined specific territories for each tribe. The tribal land usage was not well understood by US negotiators. The treaty did not account for the fact that many tribes did not recognize a singular chief who could speak for the entire tribe, and so this led to fragmented compliance. And then, of course, the annuity system was a complete failure, as we noted in the previous lesson. And then another reason, of course, that fails the permanent frontier policy, as well as this policy of concentration, is just settler encroachment. Again, it's a very simple response to why this policy failed. Settlers encroached on native lands, often disregarding their treaty boundaries. Westward expansion begins to intensify. The discovering gold in California, the Colorado gold rush, the gold rush into the Rocky Mountains. We see that settlers moved into lands promised to Native American tribes. After the gold rush in the Black Hills, thousands of miners flooded to the region as well. The construction of the Pacific Railway across native territories in the 1860s would also exacerbate these problems as well. We also see that Native Americans, particularly those living in the Great Plains, were not really accustomed to living on small restricted areas, as you can imagine. And this forced relocation to reservations often led to cultural disintegration. The Navajo people, for example, were forcibly relocated to what was essentially a concentration camp during the Long Walk of 1864, which was a brutal forced march to a reservation in New Mexico. Thousands would die along the way, and the destruction of their traditional way of life was very clear to see. Now, on the Great Plains, the loss of access to vast hunting grounds led to the disruption of trade routes and economic hardships as well. And so ultimately, this policy of permanent frontier, or this policy of concentration, this idea of essentially limiting movement of native populations and trying to keep the peace with treaties like that of Fort Laramie, all are going to be met with resistance. And this is exactly what happened. As a direct result of the failure of concentration, many Native American tribes began to resist against government encroachments. This leads to a number of different confrontations, the first of which is the Lakota War. This is sometimes known as Red Cloud's War because it is led by Red Cloud, who were particularly vocal in their opposition to the reservation system. In the 1860s, the US government began constructing forts along what was known as the Bozeman Trail, which was a route which was used by miners and settlers to the Montana goldfields. This trail ultimately passed directly through the Lakota territory, and which was then granted to them under the 1851 treaty. And so Red Cloud and his followers launched a series of attacks against the US Army. Attacks culminated in the Fetterman Massacre of 1866, where the US military detachment was ambushed and wiped out by a number of Lakota Native American warriors. After a series of defeats, the US government then had to negotiate with Red Cloud, leading to part of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which obviously temporarily closed the Bozeman Trail and established the Great Lakota Reservation. Now, other examples of resistance can be seen with groups like the Shawnee Native American tribe, which resisted forced relocation and reservations, which involved a number of multiple conflicts across the US with the US government, one of which included the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, which we will get to as its own separate lesson, I believe, in a couple of lessons' time. And this was where we see a number of mostly women and children, Native Americans, being killed by US troops. And we then get to see greater resistance as a result of that. All of this then results in the Indian Wars of 1862 to 1867, and then obviously the Sand Creek Massacre taking place within that in 1864. And that's what the subject of the next two lessons are going to be about. We're going to talk about those two conflicts with Native American groups, and then we will start to think about the Civil War. And we will spend the rest of this topic talking about all the various aspects of the Civil War, the American Civil War, which is another type of conflict that didn't directly involve Native Americans, but instead was a conflict with America itself, fundamentally. So that's what we will start to do over the next few lessons.